Today, we will be taking a look into the life and criminal career of the most powerful Canadian mafia don of all time, Vito Rizzuto. Vito Rizzuto is known for not only being the boss of the mafia in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, but also is renowned for creating a stability in the underworld of Montreal by bringing different criminal groups together. During his reign on top, the Montreal crime family was one of the strongest and most stable in all of the mafia. Vito Rizzuto was born in Cattolica Eraclea, Sicily in 1946. At the age of 8, Vito immigrated to Montreal, where he lived with his father Niccolo Rizzuto. Niccolo Rizzuto was Vito's first introduction to the mafia, as Niccolo married into the Calabrian Cotroni family and was a made man within it. Immigrating to Montreal, Niccolo didn't want to leave his lifestyle behind. Arriving in Montreal, Niccolo had his sights set on controlling not just the city but all of Canada. After getting settled into this new city, Niccolo jumped into the criminal underworld when a mob war broke out in the 70s. As Niccolo saw his chance to establish the Rizzutos as the boss of Montreal. While this violent war was taking place, Vito was reaching his early adulthood. During this time, Vito would follow in his father's footsteps and get involved in the life, committing crimes to help his father gain control of the underworld. Vito at a young age was seen as the future of the Montreal Mafia. Vito first ran into the law in 1968 when he was arrested for burning down a hair salon in order to defraud the insurance agency, being sentenced to 2 years in prison for this. Vito left the streets right as tension in Montreal was starting to heat up. Coming out of prison into the start of the war in Montreal, Vito would become closer to his father and learn the business firsthand, seeing how the rackets were controlled and how his father maneuvered to gain control. Vito learned valuable information throughout these years. Importantly, in this time period, Vito and his father would begin meeting with high-ranking members of the Bonanno crime family. At the time, the Bonanno family was a well-respected and very powerful crime family in New York, being one of the 5 major families. The Rizzutos would meet with the Bonannos in order to squash the conflict between the Rizzutos and the Viola crews in Montreal, as Rizzuto refusing to conform to Viola rule resulted in tension between the two. At the time, Montreal was seen as a sub-faction of the Bonanno family, and tension in this area would affect the Bonannos' bottom line. In order to try to stop this situation from escalating, multiple meetings were set with the goal of establishing peace. However, with these attempts failing, the Bonanno family ended up siding with the Rizzutos, leading to the violent murder of Viola and Niccolo taking power. After taking control of Montreal, Niccolo surprisingly took a step back and handed the regions of the family over to his son Vito, taking more of an advisory role. At the age of only 30, Vito was now in charge of a multi-million-dollar crime organization that has recently just got out of a war, with it being alleged that the family controlled or had a hand in gambling, extortion and drug trafficking. The family and now Vito had control over the underworld. But at the time, the Montreal faction still answered to New York. So when Rizzuto was called down to New York by future boss of the Bonanno family, Joe Massino, Vito packed his things and headed down. When Vito got to New York, he was told that he was there to participate in the murder of 3 capos that opposed the growing leadership of Joe Massino. The plan was for Massino to invite the 3 capos, Philip Giacconi, Dominic Trinchera, and Alphonse Indelicato, to a meeting to discuss their grievance, where Vito and a crew would jump out and attack the capos. With the plan set, the 3 capos arrived and armed to meet Massino and Salvatore Vitali. Then, as planned, they were suddenly ambushed by Vito and 3 other men. The chaotic scene saw a sea of bullets flying all over and people running for their life, with the bodyguard of the 3 capos, Frank Lino, managing to flee. When the chaos stopped, the hit was deemed a success as the capos were dead and Massino was able to take control. After this hit, Vito would return to Montreal, not thinking much about it. However, later he would find out that this would eventually lead to his downfall. Coming back to Montreal, the respect for Vito grew in the Bonanno family, and it has been said that he was officially inducted into the family around this time. Being back in Montreal, Vito was able to solidify his power. Seeing the instability of war, Vito went out and made alliances with the different gangs and crews in the area, laying out territory and splitting up rackets amongst the gangs, creating a sort of peace treaty in Montreal. Of course, Vito did make sure in these meetings that people knew who was truly in charge of everything that went down in Montreal. This gave Rizzuto exactly what he wanted, with Montreal seeing a time of peace. Rizzuto and his associates were able to make millions and millions of dollars without the looming threat of being shot. The only real adversity Vito saw in this time was in 1988 when Niccolo Rizzuto his father, was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in jail for cocaine trafficking in Venezuela. This of course wasn't a positive for Vito, but didn't slow him down as he continued to grow his empire. Vito started to dress in expensive suits, began meeting with politicians and making more money year after year. Being the biggest gangster in Canada at the time, Vito was given the nickname the Montreal Teflon Don and named previous legitimate to John Gotti, as he was able to live the life while evading the police. Earning the Teflon Don nickname made the Canadian government pursue Vito with all their resources. The first run-in Vito had with the RCMP, Canadian law enforcement, was in 1987 when he was arrested for allegedly importing 16 tons of hash into Newfoundland. The case seemed like a sure thing for the RCMP at the time, but they ultimately were forced to throw out the case as they were caught attempting to wiretap a privileged conversation between Vito and his lawyer. With this failure by the RCMP, they came back at Ritsuda the next year with similar charges. This time he was charged with conspiring to import 32 tons of hash through the harbor of Quebec. Vito was again able to beat this case, being acquitted after the main witness in the case was found guilty of obstruction of justice, resulting in them not being able to testify. The next case Vito was able to avoid criminal charges was a stock manipulation scheme involving the Alberta mining firm, One Way Explorers Ltd. His involvement in the scheme led to a civil suit, but no criminal charges were filed. Finally, the last case Vito was able to avoid was in the 1990s when 46 associates of Vito, including his lawyer, were convicted for money laundering, with his lawyer being found guilty of laundering around $50 million. Despite being named as a co-conspirator, the RCMP found that they did not possess enough evidence to charge Vito Ritsudo, with the government not being able to pin anything on Vito. Vito's notoriety and competence grew, avoiding the police for decades. Vito was able to run his empire relatively stress-free, with stories coming out of Ritsudo making millions off public work construction contracts. Surveillance showing policymakers and construction bosses meeting with Ritsudo. The reach of his organization was seen all throughout Montreal, conducting business out of the Cosenza Social Club. Vito would provide mediation for gangs throughout not just Montreal but throughout Canada. With such dominance in Montreal, other mafia leaders came to Vito for reinforcement and advice, allowing Vito to hold immense influence across provinces. Living this high-rolling lifestyle, traveling all over the world, driving luxury cars, and dining at fine restaurants, Vito was not shy about using his power. Doing all this while, official documents stating he didn't own a credit card and brought in around a few $100,000 from being a shareholder in a construction firm infuriated law enforcement, with many in law enforcement angered by the notion that he flew under the radar. Some in law enforcement would state that he didn't ever try to hide who he was, living his life the way he wanted and enjoying power he had. Vito lived as loud as any mafia boss of his time, living as the utmost authority in Montreal for over 2 decades. The seemingly untouchable Vito Ritsudo was shocked when a murder that took place over 20 years ago in the U.S. was what took him down. In 2004, Vito Ritsudo was extradited to the U.S. in charge for his involvement in the 3 Campo murder, with seemingly everyone in the Bonanno family, including the then boss Joe Massino, being willing to cooperate. Ritsudo's chances of beating the case were slim to none, ultimately being charged for conspiracy and accepting a plea deal of 10 years. Only serving 5, Vito was sent to jail in the Colorado Penitentiary. On top of this sentence, he had a warrant in Italy for his arrest for trying to launder over $6 million into building a bridge in Messina, keeping Vito out of his birth country. While in prison, the stability of the Ritsudo family came crashing down. Seeing the powerful leader send away members throughout the area saw it as their chance to take control, with a violent war taking place between the warring groups. On top of this, law enforcement amped up the arrest for the Ritsudo crew, seeing the strong family beginning to falter. This weakening is what many suspected led to the murder of Vito's son Niccolo Jr. and his father Niccolo Sr. Seeing an opportunity to take out the Ritsudo family, ambitious crews shot and killed Niccolo Jr. outside of his office, and in an even more brazen act, they shot and killed Niccolo Sr. with a sniper rifle as he sat at his dinner table. These 2 murders, along with the murder of other close associates, sent Vito into a rage while in prison. Vowing to get revenge, Vito spent his final days in prison planning his attack for when he got out. With the factions trying to take over the Ritsudos turning on each other, Montreal was still up for grabs. So, when Ritsudo came home in 2012, he was ready to take back control. Being released in 2012, and Binge immediately sent back to Toronto. Vito purchased himself an armored car and headed back to Montreal. Upon arriving back in Montreal and getting settled, Montreal experienced the most violent period that has ever been seen, with an estimated 10 people associated with the Montreal underworld being murdered in the year Ritsudo returned. With his alleged involvement in these murders, it was clear that Vito was sending a clear message for those that tried to take over when he left. The first of these murders came a month after Vito's release, with 4 people being killed in this month alone. These included the murder of 3 drug dealers associated with the kidnapping of Vito's associate. The fourth was the murder of rival Joe DeMalo in his driveway. In the following month, a gunman went into a coffee shop killing another rival, Dominic Facchini. The next month, Gaston Gosselin, brother-in-law of Reynold Desjardins, was killed in front of his house. In the same month, an associate of Vito's biggest rival, Giuseppe Di Vito, named Vincenzo Scuderi, was murdered as well. This happened a few months before Vito was allegedly able to get someone to kill Giuseppe Di Vito while in prison. This was allegedly done by an associate of Vito, poisoning Giuseppe Di Vito with cyanide. Not done there. In the same month, 3 more of Ritsudo's rivals, including the man suspected of killing his father, were all killed. The final man killed in this bloody and violent revenge tour was a man named Gallo, who was murdered in Acapulco, Mexico in November 2013. After one of the bloodiest years in Montreal's history, Vito seized control of Montreal once again. But this reign would be short, as in December of 2013 Ritsudo would pass away from pneumonia associated with lung cancer at the age of 67. With it being ruled natural causes at the time, some have speculated this may not be the case. With no official autopsy being performed, some speculate that Vito was poisoned, which ultimately led to his death. This, however, has not been proven and could just be made up to add to the story of Vito Ritsudo. After Vito's death, the war in Montreal picked back up, with different mafia factions, biker gangs, and other organized crime groups all fighting for control. Montreal and the Canadian underworld is still unstable up to today, with an estimated anywhere from 20 to 50 people being murdered in the years following. The fight for control is still ongoing, Montreal being a hotspot for crime due to the access to the ports, the always warring city saw relative peace during Vito's time at the top. However, his reign started from and ended with a violent gang war. Being born into the life and following in his father's footsteps, Vito was able to rise to the top of the mafia in Canada and was respected throughout. With it being alleged to some Leonardo being the head of the family, now the Ritsudo still holds sway in the underworld of Canada.